All right, Rabbi, say we're on DAF Mem Beis Amud Aleph, and I just want to review what we learned on the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Beis. The Gemara is now suggesting that this whole concept that we were discussing yesterday about, we know from our Mishnah that if you're forcibly removed from your tchum on Shabbos and then you're forcibly returned, so then you're not penalized, and you get to keep the tchum that you started off with on Shabbos. If, however, you're forcibly removed and you're stuck in a place which is outside of your tchum, all you have is Daled Amos. Okay, you're stuck. Now, the Gemara yesterday had talked about a case of inanimate objects. A tomato, right? Mr. Tomato. The Gemara had said that it makes no difference whether the tomato is moved forcibly by non-Jews, or whether it's moved b'mezid by a Jew who's willfully sinful. In either case, as long as it's returned back to its spot, then the tomato is like a Jew who was forcibly moved, because the tomato has no volition, the tomato has no knowledge. You don't go after the knowledge of the mover, you go after the knowledge of the movee. And in this case, the thing being moved is without knowledge, without sentience. And therefore, it's no different from being coerced. And as a result, it makes no difference whether the intent of the mover was willfully sinful, b'mezid, or whether it was b'shogeg. The tomato reacquires its original tchum by being returned back to its spot. And the Gemara had said, but this is challenged by a brisa. And the brisa that we saw yesterday is Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov say that the only time that the inanimate object is not limited in its movement and it goes back to its original tchum boundaries of 2,000 amas is only when it's returned unintentionally, unwillfully, without knowledge, right? So you see that the intent of the mover is a criterion according to this brisa. So the Gemara answers Tanoihi, and this is the bottom line of Mem Aleph Amud Beis. The Tanya, as the brisa says, Peiros sheyatzu chutz l'tchum b'shogeg ye'achlu b'mezid lo ye'achlu. If produce is look who's here. Produce. Baruch Machayim Mesim. If produce is moved outside the tchum, if produce is moved, you really chose a zinger of a DAF to come back on, I hope. Well, hopefully we'll be able to figure it out. If produce is moved out of the tchum, so now it's completely out of the tchum, it's beyond its 2,000 amas. So if it got there b'shogeg, then it's allowed to be eaten by a person who's outside the tchum. In other words, let's say the produce was moved a mile away, outside the tchum, and there happens to be a person who lives in that area. So he's allowed to benefit from that, even though the produce was moved in a place where it's completely outside of its tchum. And b'mezid lo ye'achlu. However, if it was moved there b'mezid, then the produce cannot be moved. It cannot be eaten. Rabbi Nechemia omer b'makoman ye'achlu, shelo b'makoman lo ye'achlu. And Rabbi Nechemia says, if it was returned back to its original space, it seems like Rabbi Nechemia is talking about a completely different scenario from the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama is talking about where the produce is displaced and taken outside the tchum. Rabbi Nechemia is now talking about a case where it was taken out of the tchum and then put back in its original spot. So if it's put back in its original spot, it's allowed to be eaten. But if it's left out in its displaced position, then it's not allowed to be eaten. So the Gemara now wants to clarify what's the machlokas between Rabbi Nechemia and the Tanna Kama. My b'makoman, what does it mean if it's returned back to its spot, where Rabbi Nechemia says it's permitted? Ilema b'makoman b'mezid, v'haketani behejer Rabbi Nechemia v'Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov armim la'olam asr matshichas l'makoman shogegin, v'shogegin b'mezid lo. You can't tell me that Rabbi Nechemia means that if it was returned back to its original position, b'mezid, that the produce is permitted, because the brisa we just quoted a moment ago cited explicitly the same Rabbi Nechemia together with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov as saying that it's only permitted when it's returned to its spot if it's returned back b'shogeg, but it's not permitted if it's returned back b'mezid. So that can't be what Rabbi Nechemia is saying over here. So elalav b'makom and b'shogeg. So rather, Rabbi Nechemia is only permitting us to take the produce for ourselves when it's returned back to its spot b'shogeg, and therefore v'chisuri mechzer v'hachi ketani. So therefore, there's a little bit of a disconnect between Rabbi Nechemia's statement and the Tanna Kama statement, and therefore you have to read it as follows. So the Tanna Kama says as follows: if produce leaves the tchum, if it leaves the tchum b'shogeg and it's there in its displaced position, so then if it got there b'shogeg, it's allowed to be eaten. If it's left there b'mezid, it's not allowed to be eaten. But that's only true if it's in its displaced position. But if it's returned back to its original spot, then afilu b'mezid ye'achol. Then it can be eaten even if it was returned back to its spot b'mezid. That's what the Tanna Kama is telling us. The Asa Rabbi Nechemia lameimar afilu b'makoma nami b'shogegin b'mezid lo. And that's where Rabbi Nechemia is coming to disagree. And he's coming to say that no, even when it's returned back to its original spot, it'll only be permitted if it got there b'shogeg, but if it got there b'mezid, then it's not going to be okay. So what you see from here, the Gemara says is QED. We've therefore demonstrated that there's a machlokes tanoim between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Nechemia in a situation where the produce was displaced and then returned, and it was done b'mezid. According to the Tanna Kama, as long as it was returned to its original spot, it retains its original tchum, and therefore people can take it and use it for themselves. But according to Rabbi Nechemia, if the only time that it's permitted when it's returned back to its original spot, if it was returned b'shogeg by the mover, but if the mover was amazed, then it's not going to be permitted.
So who said if you take it beyond the tchum b'mezid that it is permitted?
No one. No one.
Start off that way?
No. That's no.
Okay.
No.
So b'mezid chutz l'tchum for sure. Yes.
Right. B'mezid when it's chutz l'tchum, it seems like from this discussion that everyone agrees that it's aser. That sort of that the only time is when right is we had said.
Because it's not about bechira, I thought that's what
right. Perosh yasachus l'tchum b'chazru. Rav Papa's statement was only if they leave and then they come back. See, because by a bardas also, if he's forcibly removed, he loses his tchum and his only limit is limited to stay where he is. He can't move. So the same thing will be true by produce.
The mover in this case is
a Jew.
Right, because
there's a distinction between a shogig and a mezid. By a nachri, there is no distinction. So now the Gemara says, lo. That's the way you try to interpret it, but I could say it not that way. I could say, b'mezid b'makoma and dekuli alma lo pligi de aser. Maybe I'll tell you that both the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Nechemia hold that if it is returned back to its spot b'mezid, it'll always be aser. V'hacha b'shogeg shelo b'makoman pligi. And maybe the only machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Nechemia is if it's in its displaced position, when it's removed from outside the tchum and has not been returned. That's where there's a machlokas. Tanna Kama savar b'shogeg shari shelo b'makoman, that the Tanna Kama is of the opinion that if it's shelo b'makoman, if it's in its displaced position, then as long as it got there b'shogeg, it'll be permitted. You're allowed to move it around. It's not considered to be frozen in that spot. And the Rabbi Nechemia savar afilu shogeg b'makoman in shelo b'makoman lo. And Rabbi Nechemia comes and he says no, that even a case of shogeg, the only time we can permit a shogeg is if it's returned back to its original spot. But if it's in its displaced position, even if it got there b'shogeg, says Rabbi Nechemia, you're not allowed to move it at all. And that's, the Gemara says, but maybe everyone agrees that if it was returned back to its spot b'mezid, everyone would agree that it would be aser. It loses its tchum. The Gemara says, no, you can't say that, because v'amid ketani seifa, Rabbi Nechemia v'Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov omrim la'olam asurin ad sheyichazu l'mekoman shogigin b'mezid lo nichlal de Tanna Kama sarva b'mezid nami sharish mamina. Right? So the Gemara says no. The very fact that this brisa that we first started off with says that Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Eliezer say la'olam asurin, it is always going to be usher until it returns back to its spot b'shogeg. So that implies that they're coming to directly argue with the Tanakama, even b'makoman, even when it's returned back to its spot. You can't tell me that they only disagree in a case of shelo b'makoman when it's in its displaced position, because then the language of la'olam it's usher, it's always going to be usher until you fulfill this criterion implies that they're arguing in multiple places. They're arguing both when it's shelo b'makoman and they're arguing b'makoman, because it's mashma from this language of la'olam that Rabbi Nechemia is coming to address that it's only permitted in this scenario, where there's the Tanakama holds that it's going to be permitted in multiple scenarios, both in the scenario of shelo b'makoman and in the scenario of b'makoman. And therefore, Shema Mina, says the Gemara, we see from here that there is a bona fide machlokas tanoim as to when it's returned back to its spot b'meza. The Tanakama says it's permitted, meaning you can move it, and Rabbi Nechemia says you're not allowed to move it. Shema Mina. That concludes it. QED. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. So Rav Nachman says in the name of Shmuel. You don't know what QED means?
Questions?
Look it up in Google. It's after a mathematical proof. You write QED. It's Latin. It's Latin. It's Latin for some. I forget the Latin term. Yeah. Shema Mina.
It's been proved.
Shema Mina. That's what it's Shema Mina. Okay. Amar of Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Haya mahalech, ve'ena yodea tchum Shabbos. Next case. A person is walking, and he doesn't know where he's been kaina shvisa, and he doesn't know where his 2,000 boundary, 2,000 amma boundary stops. So here's what he can do. Mahalech alpayim psios beinonios, v'zohi tchum Shabbos. So we're liberal in this regard, I guess because it's only a derabanan. And we tell him, take 2,000 steps, count 2,000 medium-sized steps, and that's where you should stop. That will delineate your boundary. We don't require you to have a measuring tape. Take 2,000 medium steps, and that's where your 2,000 amma stops.
This is reminiscent of being stuck in the desert and not knowing when Shabbos is.
Right. It's a little bit, yeah. One's time and one's space. The Amar of Nachman Amar Shmuel, Shavas bevika v'hikifu hanachim. Now here's it gets a little bit more complicated case, and this is really going to be the subject of our discussion today. A person makes Shabbos in a plain, which is an open space. Let's assume it's a Carmelis, and come along non-Jews on Shabbos, and they build a fence. They fence around all the place where I am resting on Shabbos, and mechitza b'Shabbos. So the halacha is mahalech alpayim amma umetaltel bekula al yedei zrika. So here comes along Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, and he says as follows. Let's say we know that when a person is out in the middle of nowhere in a field, there are two issues here. One is the issue of tchum, and the other is the issue of carrying. So when it comes to the issue of tchum, his radius is 2,000 amas in all directions. That's regardless of whether it's a Carmelis, whether it's Rishus Harabim, Rishus Hayachid, it makes no difference, right? If, however, let's say non-Jews enclose, and by the way, wherever I am at the inception of Shabbos, that defines my 2,000 amma tchum. There's another halacha, however, when it comes to carrying. If at the inception of Shabbos I'm in an area where I'm not allowed to carry, if non-Jews were to build a fence around it and make it hukaf ladira, and make it into an enclosed, habitable Rishus HaYachid, the halacha would be that I'm allowed to carry in that spot, even if at the inception of Shabbos I wasn't allowed to carry. So here's the following scenario. I'm in the middle of a field, my radius is 2,000 amas, I wake up in the morning and there's a fence all around where I was sleeping, but the fence is beyond my 2,000 amma boundaries. Let's say it's at a 3,000 amma radius all around me. So I'm still limited to not walk past my 2,000 amma boundary, and I'm also allowed to carry now. I'm allowed to carry objects within my 2,000 amma boundary, and I can even carry beyond the 2,000 amma boundary as long as I remain within the walls. How can I carry if I can't walk there? I can throw. So I got my little red rubber ball that I've been sleeping with all night. It's my little mascot. And I walk out to the 2,000 amma boundary, and then I throw the red rubber ball, and it hits the fence. That's what I'm allowed to do on Shabbos. That's what Rav Nachman says in the name of Shmuel.
Does that mean that now the boundaries have limited him, but not inanimate objects? That's why the object...
No.
So why can the object go past? I guess we'll find out.
Oh, you're asking a good question.
Yeah.
You're asking, what about the boundary of the inanimate object?
Right.
Right. That's an interesting question. So Mark is asking, what about the fact that the inanimate object is bounded? So I don't know. I don't know about that. Why is the inanimate object not bounded by the...
Because this place
Shom to Chaim Milan.
is out of the Tchum. It's 1,000 feet.
Well, maybe it is bounded, but...
So why can you throw it? Well, he said you're throwing it past the tchum.
He can do an avera. He can do an avera. It's not permitted, but he'll be punished for...
No, wait a minute. It's not... One second. Is it an avera to throw an object that's outside of its tchum? Or is it just that once it's outside of its tchum, it can't be moved any further?
Well, it probably has to be above the 10 amos, no?
So he's moving it. So he's moving it past the tchum. That was the cause of it to move.
No.
What if it was a piece of barbecue chicken and you threw it and a goy brought it back?
Okay. Couple. You don't ask questions like that on the first day back. Hold up.
Quiet.
All right.
What about boiled chicken?
Well, I mean, does the object have a...
Okay. So anyway, but Mark is raising an interesting question, and I'm just thinking that the ball that you're throwing, you're right, it's Konish Visa, and it too it's bounded by 2,000 amas, but it could be that it's once you get it out of where it's supposed to be, it's limited at that point. But it seems like from the Gemara that there's no problem of throwing it beyond there. So that's Rav Nachman. Rav Huna Omar, Mahalech Alpayim Amma. Rav Huna says that you're only allowed to walk 2,000 amas, umetal til daled amos, and you're only allowed to carry for daled amos, meaning that you're not allowed to carry more than you'd be allowed to carry in a Rishus Harabim. You can't even carry within your 2,000 amas, even though right now it's a Rishus HaYachid.
What do you think would make a difference?
Correct? Yeah. So the Gemara's question now is V'nital tel bekula al yedei zrika. So the Gemara asks the question, why wouldn't he be permitted to walk and carry with it, and walk up to his 2,000 amas and throw the object further? So the Gemara says, Shema yimoshech acher cheftzo, that the answer is, we're worried that if we allow you to throw the object beyond your 2,000 amas, you'll be drawn after it, meaning that you'll want to follow it, you'll want to walk after it, and go after the red rubber ball. And that we don't allow you to do because you'll be leaving your tchum. So therefore, Rav Huna says you cannot take the ball past the 2,000 amas.
Is that the Rabbi? Not the Rabbi.
Yeah. It's all part of the Gzeira. So now the Gemara asks, Ba'alpayim mihas litaltil ki urche. But then let's at least let you carry within the 2,000 amas. Why are you only limiting me to dalet amos? You should be able to carry 2,000 amas. The Gemara answers, Mishum dahavi kemechitza shenifritza b'milua lamakom daha asur. So the Gemara answers an interesting answer. We know that there's a halacha. Let's say I'm in a Rishus HaYachid, let's say I'm in a field which is bounded by 4 walls, and all of a sudden a breach takes place and one of the walls is completely knocked down and opens up into a Rishus Harabim. So the halacha is that since there's no barrier between my place where I am and the Rishus Harabim, so my Rishus HaYachid is no longer, it's been compromised and I'm not allowed to carry in this Rishus HaYachid anymore. In this scenario as well, since I cannot carry up to the fence, it's if my domain is breached, the periphery of where I'm allowed to go to is completely breached. And since it's completely breached and abutting a place where I'm not allowed to go and I'm not allowed to carry, so then I'm not allowed to carry even within my 2,000 amas. That's the argument that Rav Huna makes. Now, Chia Barav Amar, Mahalach Alpayim Amma, Umetaltel be'alpayim amma. So Chia bar Rav is a third opinion. Now he seems to be the junior of, in other words, he's a junior Amora of Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. And he says you're allowed to walk 2,000 amas, you're allowed to carry 2,000 amas, but you can't throw past the 2,000 amma point. So the Gemara says, Kiman, the lo Rav Nachman, the lo Rav Huna. Who does this go like? It's not like Rav Nachman who says you can throw even beyond the 2,000, and it's not like Rav Huna who says you're only allowed to carry dalet amos. So Ema metaltel ba'arba. So therefore you have to modify Chia bar Rav's position and say that he only permits you to carry dalet amos, not to carry 2,000 amos. Frek the Gemara ihachi hainu de Rav Huna. Well, if that's the case, then he's saying just like Rav Huna says. And for the Gemara, Ema v'chein amar Rabbi Chia bar Rav. So therefore, Chia bar Rav is only concurring with Rav Huna, and we still only have two opinions. Either you can carry the full 2,000 amas and throw beyond the 2,000 amas, or you're not allowed to carry at all beyond the regular dalet amos, and you're only allowed to walk up to the 2,000 amma mark.
If he agrees, why did the Gemara include it?
Because the Gemara wants to say that we have another Amora that supports Rav Huna, a later Amora that subscribes to Rav Huna.
Rabbi,
Yes.
if he has a lassie, can he bring the ball back and throw it again?
Can he have a dog fetch the ball? So yeah, it's a good question. L'chora, he should be allowed to do that.
But he couldn't tell the dog to go again. The dog would just go on and jump.
Why not? Why can't we? Well, it depends. You're not allowed to have a dog do malacha for you, so that's an interesting question.
Is it a Jewish dog?
Okay, guys, let's go. All right. Amalei Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. Rav Nachman says to Rav Huna, Lo tiflog alei d'Shmuel d'Tanya kavase. He says to him, I don't want you to disagree with my Rebbe Shmuel, who I was quoting. Remember the more permissive opinion. And the reason you shouldn't argue with him is because there's a brisa that supports him. The Tanya, as the brisa says, Hayamodeid uba v'kol samidaso b'chatzi ha'ir. Let's say a person was Kona Shvisa, and he's measuring his 2,000 amas beyond his boundaries, and at the end of the 2,000 amas, he discovers he's in the middle of another city, another town. So the question is, what are his rights within that town itself? So mutar l'taltol b'chol ha'ir kula, u'bilvad shelo yavor satchum b'raglav. So it seems a contradictory statement. He's allowed to carry within the entire town, as long as he doesn't trespass beyond the 2,000 amma mark with his feet. Now, how do you do that? So how do you carry in the entire town if half the town is beyond your 2,000 ammas? And at the same time, abide by the rule that you can't walk past 2,000 ammas. So the Gemara says, "B'may metalta lav al yedei zrika." It must be that we're permitting you to throw. So therefore, you see that you're. Oh, by the way, Mark, maybe I'll answer your question. Maybe the red rubber ball was not where I was sleeping. Maybe it wasn't sleeping next to me. Maybe the red rubber ball was at the edge of my 2,000 amas. I just thought of that. Okay? I don't know. Maybe. Okay? Would it work? Okay. So anyway, so b'may metaltel. How are you carrying? How are you carrying if you're not walking? Lav al yedei zrika must be that we're permitting you to throw an object beyond your 2,000 amas. So therefore, don't argue with Shmuel. He's got a brisa to support him. So the Gemara says, Amar lecha Rav Huna lo al yedei meshicha. The answer is pulling something in, which means like this. Let's say you find a knapsack at the edge of your 2,000 amas. There's a knapsack right outside the 2,000 amas. So it's there where the brisa says you're allowed to carry it even though it's beyond your 2,000 amas by pulling it in. See, there's no fear of you being drawn after the knapsack because you're pulling it into your domain, not pushing it outside or throwing it outside of your domain. So therefore, Rav Huna says you have no raya from that brisa. The brisa maybe is not referring to throwing, it's referring to pulling something into your domain. Amar Rav,
You have to reach it.
you have to reach it, so you bend over, even though your feet are still within the 2,000, you bend your body over outside of the 2,000. Amar Rav Huna, Hayamodeid uba v'kolso midasa b'chatzer, Chatzer ein lo ela chatzi chatzer. I'm sorry, yeah. So hayamodedu kol sminusa b'chatzi chatzer ein lo ela chatzi chatzer. The Rav Huna says that if you're measuring your tchum from where you were kona shvisa, you measure 2,000 amas, and it stops in the middle of a courtyard. So all you have is that half of the courtyard that's within your 2,000 amas. The Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Ema yesh lo chatzi chatzer. So the Gemara says the thing that's not so obvious is that we actually give you the half of the chatzer that's within your boundaries. So the Gemara says, Hainomi Pshita. But that should also be obvious. It's within my 2,000 amas. Why shouldn't I walk? So because you might have thought that maybe we shouldn't allow you to traverse there because maybe you'll come to carry in that courtyard and you'll carry it throughout the entire courtyard. So ka mashmalan, right? Therefore the chiddush is that even though you might be tempted to carry beyond because it's within all the same courtyard, kamashmalan that we permit it. Amar of Nachman moideli huna hayamodei uba v'kol samidas al sfas tikra muter letalta b'chol habayis. My time a whole b'tikras habayis chovetes. So Rav Nachman says that Rav Huna will agree with me in the following case. Even though Rav Huna says that you're not allowed to carry within your 2,000 amas, and because we're worried that you're going to throw the object and you'll be drawn after it, but Rav Huna will agree with me in the following scenario. Let's say your 2,000 amas ends right up against a structure. In other words, there's an open area where your 2,000 amas extends, and at the end of the 2,000 amas, instead of it continuing as an open area, it abuts a structure which has a roof but has no wall. There, Rav Huna would say that it's permitted if you wanted to pick up a ball at that point and throw it into the structure, you would be allowed to, and we're not concerned that you're going to be drawn after it. Why not? Because you have a physical demarcation to remind you that you've reached the end of your 2,000 amas. The only time Rav Huna is worried that you're going to be drawn after the object that you throw is if there's no physical marker or demarcation to tell you you've reached the limit. But here, where there's a physical demarcation, then he says it's okay. Right? Amar Rav Huna berei de Rav Nasan kitanai. This whole issue as to whether you're allowed to throw something beyond your tchum because of a fear that you'll be drawn after it or not, right, is a machlokas tanoi. And now we go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said, Holichuhu le'ir acheres v'nosnuhu b'dir o b'sar, that if a person is forcibly taken out of his tchum and he's placed in a corral or a barn, so Rabbi Gamliel v'Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah omrim, mahalech es kula. They hold that you're allowed to traverse the entire barn, even though you only normally have dalet amos when you've been displaced out of your tchum. But over here, since you're in an enclosed area, you can traverse the entire enclosed area. The Rabbi Yoshua, the Rabbi Akiva omrim eno ela arba amos, and Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Akiva disagree, and they say even in an enclosed area, you can only walk dalet amos, but you have to stay stuck in your place. So the Gemara is going to make a very interesting comparison. My lav, Rabbi Gamliel v'Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah d'amru mahalech es kula, the lo gazri hiluch dir b'sahar atu hiluch b'bika. He says, you know what it must be? It must be that even though if you're displaced out of your tchum and you end up in an open field, you're stuck and you can't move at all more than dalet amos, right? So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Gamliel say that we're not gozer on an enclosed space atu an open space. Just because in an open space you can't move doesn't mean that in an enclosed space you can't move. We'll allow you to move even though the two cases are comparable. Umidehilach atu hilach lo gazru, tiltul atu hilach lo gazri. So the Gemara makes a sort of a logical argument which seems a little bit fuzzy to me, and the Gemara is going to knock it down in just a moment, but this is the basic argument. If these two Tanoim are not concerned about you getting confused between an open space and a closed space as far as traversing the area, it stands to reason that they're not concerned that if we allow you to carry something, that you're going to come to walk to try and traverse the place where we allow you to carry it. Just like they're not concerned that if we allow you to traverse scenario A, you're going to come to traverse scenario B, scenario A being an enclosed area, scenario B being the open area, Similarly, if we allow you to throw something in scenario A, we're not concerned that in that same scenario you're going to come to walk to the place where we allow you to carry, to transport. That's the argument. That's the sort of connection between the two. And therefore the Gemara wants to say that Rav Nachman and Rav Shmuel hold like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, the Omrim Eino Ela Arba Amos, the Gazri Hilach Dir V'Sahar Atu Hilach Debika, or the Hilach Atu Hilach Gazru Tiltal Atu Hilach Nami Gazru. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua say that when you find yourself in an enclosure outside your tchum, you're only allowed to walk Dalet Amos. So why is that? Presumably it's because they feel that even though technically you should be allowed to walk the entire space of the enclosure, but if we allow you to do it in this scenario, you're going to come to do it in an open field scenario, and therefore we're gozer over here, atu over there, and if they're prepared to be gozer, that we don't allow you to traverse space A, lest you come to traverse space B, it also stands to reason that they would not allow you to transport an object to a place that they're worried that you may come to traverse illicitly. That's the connection that the Gemara wants to make. So the Gemara says it's a very loose connection. Mimai, how do you know that? Dilma kilo gazi Rabbi Gamliel v'Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah hilach sahar v'dira to hilach bika hani mili hasam d'shnei makamos saying. Maybe the only reason why Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Gamliel are not concerned and allow you to traverse an enclosed space is because an enclosed space is different from an open space. They're two different domains. They're two different spaces. Physically, they're two different places. And they're not worried that by allowing you to traverse a closed space, you're going to traverse an open space. But in the same scenario, not where you're dealing with two different physical scenarios, but if you're dealing with the same scenario, maybe it stands to reason that they would agree with Rav Huna, that we will not permit you to carry lest you come to be drawn and traverse that area where we allow you to transport an object to. It's because it's the same scenario. We're not going to allow you to transport an object to a place where you're not allowed to traverse. That seems to be reasonable. That's a totally different kind of gezerah. V'Rabbi Yehoshua v'Rabbi Akiva nami. Mimai de mishum de gazri hu, dilma mishum de kosavri ki amrinan kol abayas kulu ka'arba amos dami, hani mili hecha de shavas ba'avir mechitzos mi ba'ojam. Aval hecha de lo shavas ba'avir mechitzos mi ba'ojam lo. And furthermore, let's take a look at Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva. Your assumption was that the reason why they don't allow you to traverse the entire enclosure is because even though technically it's permitted, but it's because of a concern that if we allow you to traverse the enclosure, you'll come to traverse an open space. Maybe that's not their reason for being machmir. Maybe the reason for being machmir is that the only time that we treat an enclosure as your personal dalet amos, regardless of how large the enclosure is that's only true when you were there at the inception of Shabbos. But if you weren't there at the inception of Shabbos, then we don't consider the entire enclosed space as being your dalet amos. And therefore, if you're forcibly moved there in the middle of Shabbos, all you have is dalet amos. And if that's the case, then Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva's concern has got nothing to do with being gozer this atu that, this lest you come to do that, but rather it's because me'ikar hadin, you're not allowed to move past dalet amos even in an enclosed space since you weren't there at the beginning of Shabbos. And therefore it's got nothing to do with being gozer, throwing something lest you come to traverse it. It's not this atu that, it's this because this is the din. So the Gemara says, Amarav, so fine. So that was an interesting exercise in trying to compare, and the Gemara says that the comparison is not an apt comparison. Now let's find out who we paskin like. Amarav hilchasa kirabin gamliel bedir v'sahar usfina, that as far as when a person is forcibly moved into an enclosed area outside of his tchum, we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel when it comes to a boat. But and we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel when it comes to a deer and a sahar as well, which means that whether you're forcibly moved into an enclosed area in the middle of Shabbos, or whether you find yourself in a boat and the boat itself moves outside of your tchum against your will on Shabbos, In both of those cases, we allow you to traverse the entire enclosure, whether that enclosure is a barn, a corral, or a boat itself. However, Ushmuel Amar, no, he disagrees, and he says, Hilchasak Rabbi Gamliel Bisfina Abel Bedir V'Sahar Lo. And Shmuel says, no, the halacha is only like Rabbi Gamliel, that you can traverse the entire area, is if you find yourself in a boat that has left the tchum in the middle of Shabbos. Then we allow you to traverse the entire boat. But if you find yourself displaced from your tchum and placed into a corral in the middle of Shabbos, so then you're not allowed to move. You have to stay in your Dalet Amos. So Dekuli Alma Mihas Halacha Rabbi Gamliel Bisfina. Everyone, however, agrees that we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel when the boat is displaced and you're on the boat. So the question is, my time. What's the reason? That it's clear that everyone paskins like Rabbi Gamliel. Amar Rabba, Hol v'shavas ba'avir mechitzos mi ba'od yom. So Rabba says, well, the difference between a boat and being moved into a corral is when you were on the boat from the beginning of Shabbos. So since you were on the boat from the beginning of Shabbos, and it's the boat that moved outside the tchum, you didn't move outside the boat, so you and the boat are linked and connected, and therefore we consider the boat to be your private space, no matter how large it could be a carnival cruise boat, but it's still considered to be your full Dalet Amos, the entire space of the walls of the boat, within the walls of the boat. And Rabbi Zera Amar Holu Sfina Notlasu Mitchilas Arba Umanchasa Besof Arba. And Rabbi Zera gives a different svara. Now it's not clear what he's really saying, but we'll learn like the last shot in Rashi, which is as follows. Rabbi Zera says because the floor beneath you is constantly moving. The only time a person is confined to Dalet Amos is if he's deposited outside of his Tchum and rests on terra firma, where we can definitively ascertain what your new space is. Once we ascertain what your new space is outside of your Tchum, you're anchored there, you're stuck there, and you cannot move Dalet Amos from that spot. But on a boat, it's like a moving target. You're never anchored in any one place because the boat is constantly moving. And therefore, there's no reason to confine you to Dalet Amos, and we can allow you to traverse the entire ship. So, my beinayu, what will be the difference between the two reasons? So, ika beinayu shenitchesu dofnei svina. One difference will be is if the walls of the ship on Shabbos collapse, and instead of it being a ship, it's now a raft. So you're on a raft, and in this scenario, so Rashi explains. So therefore, according to Rabba, since Rabba's whole position was that the boat is your personal enclosed area, no matter how large it is considered to be like your personal Dalet Amos, so you lose that enclosure because the walls have fallen off. And so therefore you're no longer in an enclosed area which would allow you to traverse more than Dalet Amos. So according to Rabba, you can't move now any more than Dalet Amos. But according to Reb Zera, since you're constantly a moving target and your Dalet Amos have never been established, you're allowed to keep moving even though the walls have fallen down. And the Inami, another nafkamina will be, is Bekofetz Misfina Lisfina, is if you jump ship, literally, jump ship, right? If you jump from one ship to another, so according to Rabba, again, it's not the same domain that you started with at the inception of Shabbos, and therefore you're stuck Dalet Amos. But according to Reb Zera, since you're constantly moving, you've never been pegged with as any specific Dalet Amos, and therefore you'd be allowed to continue moving the entire domain of the new ship that you've jumped to.
What if the ship runs aground? That's on a spot.
Right, that's a good question. What if it moors into one spot and it gets stuck? That would be another nafkamina, but the Gemara doesn't speak it out at this point. But according to Reb Zera, you're right. Then you'd be stuck, and even if the ship has walls. Okay, on this note, you have a wonderful Shabbos.